Hi everyone, my name's Hayden Banks. I'm the Advocacy Manager at Climate Outreach. Thank you very much for joining us for this evening's webinar, spending your Tuesday evenings with us. So I'm joined today by Sofie Jenkinson from Round Our Way, and the pair of us are going to be delivering this webinar on how to talk climate on the doorstep at the local elections that are happening in May this year. Obviously a very busy time probably for all of you, so we really appreciate you joining us and talk through some of Climate Outreach's latest research and insights in how to have effective climate communications. I'm then going to pass over to Sofie from Round Our Way, who will talk through their amazing work looking at the impacts of climate change and how we found the impacts of climate change. We'll then hopefully have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end where we can take some questions. You should be able to see the Q&A function in the chat, and there is on the screen, and there is an option to submit questions anonymously if you would like to do that as well. The webinar will be recorded, and we do have the full hour this evening, but if we don't have too many questions or there's not much discussion, we might be able to wrap up about 7:15. But we do have the full hour if we need it. So I'm going to kick off now. And what I'll cover today is Climate Outreach's latest Britain Talks Climate and Nature research, what this tells us in terms of where the public are on climate and nature issues and how that can inform our communications. I'm going to go through a quick 101 on some effective kind of conversations and tips and tricks for having the best kind of conversations on the doorstep. We've done a bit of analysis as well with Climate Barometer on the Gorton and Denton by-election that the Green Party won. And we're going to share some of the findings and some of the kind of recommendations and the lessons that we think that by-election can tell us about having effective kind of climate conversations. And then I'll pass over to Sofie Jenkinson from Round Our Way, as mentioned, and then we'll have a Q&A discussion at the end. Hopefully you can all hear me okay and see my screen, but just let me know if not. Firstly, to say that Climate Outreach, we're a registered charity, so we're bound by the rules of the Charity Commission and the Electoral Commission. So across this election period, we're working with all the main political parties, and we're not here to provide kind of strategic political advice or advice on specific campaigns. We're really just here to present our research and our insights on having effective climate conversations and how you can use these recommendations during your campaigns in the run-up to the election period. So the first section now on our latest research, Britain Talks Climate and Nature, and we think this is really vital for understanding audiences and the different kind of audience perspectives in British society, and really getting to grips with what people think about climate and nature and how this can inform our communications. So we conduct this research every year for the past 5 years, and this involved interviewing people, conducting focus groups and holding surveys with around 7,000 people across Britain. It's a values-based segmentation, so we use more in commons 7 segments of British society to draw on for the research, and that's where all our participants were kind of drawn from that segmentation. I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. But the key findings that you need to remember for this research that will hopefully sort of be really helpful for you and inform your communications. The first being that we really are a nation of nature lovers and we want to protect our environment. We think this is really crucial. We are not in an era now of climate denialism. We're not in an era where people don't understand the science or are moving away from thinking that climate and nature issues are important. We do care and we want to see that action taking place. But the second finding, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that trust in society and in our political system and our political parties more generally is really collapsing. We're in an era of really declining trust. And that has implications for how we communicate and how we tell our stories. And thirdly, we do think that climate action has a bit of an image problem, and I'll come on to more detail about that, but it is fixable if we follow kind of the recommendations that we're putting forward today. A bit about the audience and the more in common segmentation that I mentioned, and this is really important because when you are on the doorstep and when you're out and about campaigning in your areas and your constituencies ahead of the elections, knowing your audience and who you're speaking to is perhaps the most important thing. It's vital to understand the perspectives of your audiences and what different values they hold, so you can really empathize with them and show them that you care and that you understand their worldview. So as I mentioned, Britain Talks Climate and Nature, it draws heavily on the more in common segmentation of British society. So you can see here on this graphic the 7 segments that I mentioned, and I won't go into all of these in great detail. I'm going to pick out a few of them in a moment. And our research held focus groups with people from all of these segments, and they're not this is not a political kind of breakdown of the population, so these don't align with the different political parties. They're rather more of a holistic kind of values-based segmentation, people's worldviews and people's perspectives. So you can see, for example, on the left-hand side, as the name sort of suggests, the progressive activists, which make up about 12% of the population. They're a very kind of politically minded group. We've got the incrementalist left, which I'll actually touch on in a bit more detail in a moment. Established liberals and sceptical scrollers, slightly smaller proportions of the population. The liberals, as you might expect, the most kind of well-off and the most sort of trusting segment in society. They broadly think we're going in the right direction on a lot of issues, including climate change. Skeptical scrollers are actually a new group because More in Common updated this segmentation last summer, and this was a new segment of society. They make up quite a small proportion at the moment, only about 10%, and they're a really digitally native group, typically younger, and they're very mistrusting and skeptical, as the name suggests, about the information that they receive, and they're constantly looking to kind of verify that or seek alternative media to find their sources of information. I'll come on to the rooted patriots in a moment, so I won't go into them too much. Similarly with the dissenting disruptors. The traditional conservatives is a group that is actually a shrinking proportion of society, so it's only about 8% now, and they're actually one of the hardest to engage with on climate and nature issues. So they're very concerned that the state is becoming perhaps too overbearing, and they're very put off by policies around net zero and how that will impact their lives. So just to touch in a bit more detail on a couple of these before we move on a bit more to the findings. So the incrementalist left segment is important because it's actually the biggest group nationally. You can see in the graphic there, the voting kind of breakdown for this segment. So currently this segment has the most support for the Labour Party, but not too far behind the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. And this segment is typically very concerned about kind of social and environmental issues, but they're not politically oriented. So they're not like your progressive activists watching the news constantly. You know, politics isn't kind of core to their identity. They're quite put off by kind of fraught debates and the kind of political system at the moment. They are the most likely to be taking action in their communities already. So they might be doing things like litter picking, organising kind of recycling, or cleaning up kind of their rivers locally. So they're really concerned by kind of local community issues and taking action on this. Rooted Patriot segment are also a really important segment. So this is the joint second largest segment of society. And this group typically enjoyed strong support for the Labour Party, but you can see there on the graph it was the group that switched over to the Conservatives in 2019 and then kind of back more so to Labour in the last election. But Reform are sort of gaining traction with this segment. And they are really typically described by being nostalgic for the past. So this is a segment who might have kind of former industrial industries, and they're very concerned that we're kind of going in the wrong direction. They're concerned about kind of the pace and scale of change, and they're very concerned about future generations and what they will inherit. However, this group are really, on side in terms of the need to tackle climate change. They recognise that their local environments are in decline, and they are proud of our efforts, particularly on those local kind of climate initiatives. But are simply disengaging really because of the kind of depressing and uncertain kind of agenda that's ahead of us, and are not sold at the moment on kind of net zero and the path that that's forging for us. And then just finally on going into a bit of a deep dive on these segments, a really important segment to consider is the dissenting disruptor group. This is a new segmentation drawn from actually lots of the other segments from the previous iteration of More in Commons research. And we find that this group are the most distrustful and disengaged from our current political system. They really are drawn to those political parties and leaders that are promising kind of radical shake-up of the system. They are typically found in more kind of manual service sector jobs, and geographically as well, in kind of potentially former kind of red wall, former industrial heartlands too, but also kind of suburban areas, and indeed rural areas. Quite a kind of disparate group. And as you can see, this group is really gaining support amongst in the Reform Party. So it's about 58% of this segment would choose to vote Reform if an election were held today. And on climate change, this group, they are not skeptical, so they're not kind of your climate denialists. That's a very small segment of society, but they're very distrusting of net zero, and they're very disengaged with political decision making and think that net zero is not acting in their interests. So just to come on to the research findings, we're a nation of nature lovers, and that came through really strongly in the research. So you can just see these stats here, really high levels of concern about climate change, and 74% of us think it's important. So we're not in a period where there is widespread kind of climate skepticism, as you might be forgiven for thinking from looking at some of our kind of media or political discourse, and because only about 4% of people say that they are not concerned about climate change because they don't think it's real. There's real pride for initiatives like tree planting and litter picking. About over 75% of people in this that we surveyed in this research are proud of these efforts. And indeed, there is that slightly less, but really positive, promisingly high support for renewable energy industries as well. About 64% of people citing pride in the renewable energy industries. And the nature point came through really strongly. So you can just see on this graphic, we asked people to list their top concerns regarding the impacts of climate change in the next 10 years. So people could rank kind of their top 3 ones. And you can see that of 5 of the 7 segments chose harm to nature and wildlife as their top concern, and even those kind of other segments, the Conservatives and the Disruptors, it was second place. So that's followed fairly closely by kind of more immediate kind of extreme weather and things like flooding, which I know Sofie will probably go on to talk a bit more about later. But that concern for nature and wildlife is a really unifying concern across British society at the moment when it comes to this agenda. So we have that quite positive, statistics that show that people do care and they want to see action. But at the moment, we have this real distrust in political decision making. And unfortunately, that means that concern for climate action is not translating into support for net zero policies at the moment. People are very disillusioned and they're very fearful of the future. So you can just see here, we asked people to pick a few words that described their thoughts about what the future generations will inherit. People saying things like they were worried and uncertain, frustrated as well. And we see that often when we, in focus groups, people said things that like, the government has a bit of a kind of vested interest or a bit of an agenda in net zero politics. There's a real distrust that this isn't really being done for people and done with their kind of views and values in mind. You can also see here that we asked people for their thoughts around kind of local engagement and local decision making, and people are very distrustful of consultations. So any kind of efforts to really try to engage people are unfortunately met with quite a bit of skepticism. So about half of people that we surveyed said, that they think these things are kind of just tick box exercises, and people have officials have already made up their minds. And there's a real concern about the costs of the transition as well, even amongst those more well-off segments. So before we come on to some sort of comms recommendations, we do think that at the moment, climate action is sort of being perceived as the preserve of activist groups, like your kind of Extinction Rebellion, your Just Stop Oil, or it's about kind of net zero and that whole kind of agenda. And we think that that's not a really helpful association that people are making, because both of those things are quite polarizing. But we do think that this is fixable. So whilst talking about net zero and climate change does feel polarizing, about 30% of people not even really clear what it means, there is still a significant proportion of people who think that it will be positive for the UK compared to negative. So about 48% of people cited it would be positive for us, compared to just 16% who said negative. So this is declining though, and this is the concern if we don't change our approach to our communications. With that in mind though, important to say and reiterate this positive perspectives on renewable energy. So only about 15% of people don't like seeing wind turbines, for example. That's similarly high levels of support for wind energy is also found in Reform and Conservative voters. So about 74% of those voters are neutral or positive about wind energy in particular. You can see in Wales and Scotland significant levels of support for renewables as opposed to former fossil fuel industries. And we think solar energy in particular, one that you can really kind of tap into people's pride in their communities on the doorstep as well. So I've got about 5 minutes left now, and I just want to talk you through some kind of recommendations on having effective climate communications and how we can sort of put this into practice on the doorstep. So it's important to say that throughout the years and the decades, there has been a tendency in our media narrative to really emphasize the kind of, the doom and gloom about climate change, the pessimistic language and imagery. And we really do think that we need to flip this script now and not lie to people and downplay the severity of the future that we're facing, but we need to balance this out with a really kind of more optimistic, solutions-focused agenda and story as well. You can see here, we need to change this story from one of kind of a fatalistic message about the damage being done to one where we can collectively all play our part in what the future holds. Some three key things to remember on the doorstep. Facts, unfortunately, matter less than we think. So if facts and data did motivate and inspire people, we might have kind of solved our woes a long time ago. So we connect to the stories and we kind of and something Sofie will touch on a bit as well. It's important to talk with, not at, your audience. So really thinking about those values that came through strongly through the segmentation. Important to demonstrate your passion, your credibility, but also your empathy for people's situation. And trust in the messenger matters hugely. And I've just got one slide in a moment on developing more trust as well, because that's absolutely vital. It's not just how we communicate, it's who is choosing to communicate and who are we platforming to tell these stories. We think some winning frames on the doorstep, so about climate. So we know that climate is not going to be in people's top 3 lists of concerns. And one of the things that Gorson and Denton showed us was that it's not really an effective strategy to try to just raise the salience of climate. We need to be bringing this into people's other kind of day-to-day concerns and priorities. So that's around kind of health and well-being. It's around local and national progress and pride in our communities. It's about the future, particularly for that rooted patriot segment of kind of young people and future generations comes through really strongly. It's about economy and the cost of living. It's about investment in our future and a secure future. And it's also about nature. And as we saw, nature a really unifying issue for people. We've just got some examples here, and I won't read these out, and we'll be able to send the slides around afterwards. But some really kind of key messages here around kind of health, emphasizing that we are all connected to our natural environment and it's what sustains us. So really driving that as a central message. About most people, when we ask them in focus groups, we're not aware that over half of our electricity is generated by renewables. Most people are surprised by that progress we've made, so emphasizing that really important. And the message around kind of the future and our responsibility to future generations, really crucial. So some do's and don'ts. I've sort of covered some of these, so I won't read them all out. But we think tackling kind of climate and nature together is where you can. So obviously that's not always easy to do, but that is a good tip. And often leading with kind of people's local natural environment is a good way to kind of move the conversation on to more kind of national issues rather than leading with that from the beginning. I think normalizing action to protect the environment as well is really, really crucial. There is this kind of perception gap of how people perceive how many other people care, how much other people care. So really emphasizing that, you're not weird or in the minority for recycling or taking action locally. This is a collective endeavor that we're all doing. Some things that we think is maybe best to avoid. As we've mentioned, using that term net zero, whilst it has its place in kind of more policy settings, it is very polarizing and it's not really connecting to people's everyday experience. So linking net zero with what it's trying to achieve and what it's for, that vision at the end of it is really vital. We get asked a lot about kind of myth busting or getting into kind of, countering misinformation. Obviously, there is a space for this, but we don't want to overestimate the opposition because you actually just raise the kind of profile of this misinformation and this kind of negative framing that lots of people don't believe anyway. So you'll just potentially risk giving it more traction if you spend too much time on that. Better to present the positive future that our renewable energy and nature protection is trying to convey. You can just see here an example. We presented a hypothetical council's net zero emissions target. It was kind of received in a lukewarm way. About 50% of people supported it. And just by providing that basic explanation and that vision of a better life that prioritizes health, nature, and protects future generations, the support for this really increased. And just a note on trust. You can see here from these graphs, we asked people, we presented a hypothetical statement about expanding kind of renewable energy, and we changed the messenger. So we changed the politician or the messenger for this. And as you can see, there's not really that much difference between different politicians. Granted, scientific experts are slightly more trusted, but this is just to show you that trust in general is at a very low basis. So it's not the case that somebody out there and one party leader is really more trusted than there's generally quite a low level across society. And we think that's why these three factors are really critical. And we've touched on some of these very strongly, and it's why figures like Dave clearly are passionate about what they're talking about, but they also demonstrate credibility. They know what they're talking about. You have that information and that kind of rich kind of detail that you can draw on if you need to, and perhaps most crucially, empathy as well. Really showing that you understand people's perspectives and you're not talking to them, but you're not talking down to them. You're really meeting them where they are and creating space for their concerns. I'm keen to bring Sofie in a moment. I just want to very, very quickly, finally, just give you some lessons from Gorton and Denton. So we teamed up with Climate Barometer, who are an organisation looking at kind of attitudes to climate change as well, on the local elections. And we did a quick analysis of the kind of the Green Party's kind of literature, and also their media, and Hannah Spencer's media appearances during the by-election. And it was really clear that actually terms like climate change, net zero, the environment, nature even, were used really infrequently. But it's not that these things are disappearing from their agenda or from the Green Party's platform. Indeed, particularly on television, so there was a BBC debate, for example, where Hannah Spencer really clearly linked kind of cost of living with the fossil fuel industry and our reliance on oil and gas. And she emphasized repeatedly in debates that the cost of living could be eased for people if we insulated housing and we improved people's housing stock and air quality in their local area. So we think that really focusing on the kind of hyper local action and initiatives and bringing this agenda into people's day-to-day lives is really important, because we know that climate and environment is not something that people are placing in their top three concerns. It's decreasing in salience, but it doesn't mean that people don't care. We know from our Britain Talks Climate, or BTC research, that people do care and they want action. So we need to weave this into people's kind of other day-to-day concerns, such as the cost of living. So I'm keen to bring Sofie in now, so make sure we've got time for that. So I'm going to stop there and pass over to you, Sofie.
Thank you. I'll just share my slides. 1 second. Okay. Hayden, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Thank you. So I'm just going to whiz through basically a few of the different stories we've done and who we are, just to give you a sort of sense of the type of work we do, communicating on climate, especially on climate impacts, so extreme weather, flooding, heat waves, heat generally, etc. So we share the stories of everyday climate impacts in the UK, and we go to local communities, we speak to people, we communicate with those people. So we talk to people about their experiences, and then we build stories around their stories and data to come up with various things that you'll see in a minute. And we do that mostly with people who've been impacted by extreme weather, sometimes with people who are being impacted by rising cost of food, rising energy bills. And a big focus of our work is to get perspectives that are often not heard into the debate, especially older working class people, especially those in the rooted patriot segment, which is the segment where people are most likely to identify as working class. And just sort of to add to what Hayden was saying on this segment, I mean, the threat perception for all segments went up in More in Common's most recent resegmentation, but rooted patriots also have a very risk averse. So, not only are they worried, they're also not sure they want to change anything, but they will change things like voting, for example, if they feel like they want to roll the dice because they feel like nothing's improving. So the thing about them that's really interesting, I think, and the thing about the new segmentation with Women Common is that sort of threat perception and risk aversion is something that's really like plays into the new segmentation. So that's quite interesting. And it also really comes out in how concerned people are about climate across the board, but also specifically on impacts. So we tell stories about those things. And as Hayden said in the research there, but who gets to tell stories, in our view, is as important as what the stories are. So our audience, I mean, we use the segmentation as a sort of broad guide, but our audience tends to feel like looked down on and patronized by people in the climate sector, by people that they associate with climate. And so what we try and do is to do stories in quite a different way. And people care about, as we all do, our homes, our families, those you love, communities, what's in your community, spaces like pubs, sports clubs, town halls. People really, really care about all of those things. And they care about them in the immediate term, but they also care about them in the future and in the longer term. And I think politically, it's really important to think about this because political jeopardy on the issue of climate will not always occur in a linear way or how people necessarily expect it to. It might happen like almost overnight. If you look at Valencia and the floods that happened there, the political jeopardy that happened basically overnight. People's perceived lack of, the government being unprepared or councils being unprepared is quite a big thing. So we've done some new polling recently. 81% of people in that polling said that they didn't think that we were prepared for the impacts of climate change, but 59% of people think that it is not yet too late to avoid the worst impacts. And that holds across the political spectrum. So, for example, 70% of Labour voters, 24 Labour voters think that, and 46% of all reform curious voters think that. So this is something that is true at different levels, but like at quite a high level. And I think we can we can get into this in some of the stories, but that's true for both the causes of climate change, so like your emissions and bringing those down through clean energy, but also adaptation. So how we are dealing with the impacts as they are occurring here and now and coming down the road. And we can talk about that a bit more, but like separating out adaptation and mitigation is not something that the public really do. So that's all sort of baked in to the context of the audience, I suppose. So some of what we're trying to do is grow salience and build political pressure to show that all types of different people care about this issue. And some of what we're trying to do is, as Hayden talked about, the perception gap, which is not only true in the public, people not thinking that other people care about it as much as them, but is incredibly true, especially with Westminster politics. So how much politicians in Westminster think the public care about this compared to how much the public actually care about this, there's a massive gap. And so being able to tell stories that illustrate that and talk to where people actually are on this issue is really, really important. Not least because it's effective, but also because you want people to understand that you understand them as people and you understand what they care about and what they're worried about. So I'm not going to go into this in detail really because the point of this slide, and we've already heard from Hayden on different messages that work. So you can look at all of these, there's different ones, but the worst message is no message. True on everything is just to sort of like go around the houses thinking, oh, what's the perfect message? How can I communicate on this? The best thing is to do something and to communicate on issues that people care about, including climate. And I think when we're thinking about where people are at on this issue, there is a lot of people in the climate sector that will sit and think about all the things, in this list that people are worried about and how they perceive them. But actually, this is true. That is someone's brain, what someone's life and what someone's thinking about. And that's why climate's never going to necessarily be in the top three. It's popped in there every now and again, but it's never really going to be there, especially in the sort of world we're in at the moment. but that, as Hayden says, that there's no evidence to show that that doesn't mean people have stopped caring or that they're worried. So that is all to say, that is all the context of what we do, which is to basically, we're sort of like comms execution of how you communicate to Rooted Patriots or non-climate based audiences about this stuff. So I'll go through a few different things. So we've done quite a lot of stuff on food, farming, prices, some of it's prices, some of it's yield. So Richard, who you can see on the right of the screen there, is a potato and sugar beet farmer in York, near York. And he has had a few years now where he hasn't been able to harvest any of his potatoes because they've been rotting in the ground. And there's been a lot of farmers that have experienced that, but we've also experienced these big swings between droughts and floods. And he is a brilliant spokesperson in lots of ways. But one of the most sort of startling things he ever sort of said in an interview we did with him was, this is like a multi-generational farm. His granddad ran the farm and he had to deal with floods too, but he only had to deal with two or three in his lifetime. His dad had to deal with a handful more. He's had to deal with four or five in the last 5 years. So, the sort of the extra, the way that it is growing is not again linear, but it's also really important to know that people are experiencing that because when we're coming to like the farming community with other things, it's important to know that the pressure that they are feeling and the things that they are worried about is in part fueled by what they're experiencing with the weather and how that's affecting their businesses, their mental health, their family. Equally true with people who are trying to put food on the table for their families. We've had lots of different like, carrots, lettuce, cucumbers, potatoes, lots of yields have dropped, but also things that have become more expensive or harder to get. We've done this on sort of those wide yield and pricing things, and we've done specific things. So we've done Valentine's Day chocolate, we've done Easter chocolate, we've done chicken tikka masala prices, we've done Christmas dinner, we've done this stuff on Halloween pumpkins, which are basically becoming tiny little things. So we've all sorts of different routes into this. And then we've done loads of things on like sort of different areas. So flooding, we'll start with flooding. So train cancellations and delays. We did through an FOI, getting more extreme. It's not linear. Again, some years are really bad, some aren't as bad, some are really bad, but also the infrastructure is wearing in different ways as that happens. You've got flood warnings and flood alerts generally, which are having peaks at various points. And then we've done quite a bit before on potholes. So just to go into some of those more. So everyone cares about potholes. As local politicians, you will know this. And it is something that is not entirely caused by weather, but is definitely getting worse because of that and is harder to fix and everything's more brittle and costs more money and maintaining roads is harder. And so we did freedom of information on requests on this, and then we had an academic talk to the link between the rising number of potholes and the rising number of freeze thaw cycles, which I find hard to say. We also talked to two people impacted by potholes, um, and through that together we did all of these things. So we had lots of local coverage for this. We had BBC coverage for this. We had broadcast coverage for this. We had the former nurse who'd been injured cycling and hitting a pothole go on the TV. So we had quite a lot of different coverage for it. And I think the thing that's always really interesting with these sorts of stories is you can imagine someone covering the rise in potholes, but you can't always imagine someone keeping in the climate link. And we have been quite successful in that staying in. So, as I said, it's not the entire story, but it is part of the story. So that is potholes. Um, we've also done some stuff on football. Sorry, there is meant to be a video there. Oh, there it is. Let's see if it will appear. There it is. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm just going to play a little bit to give you a sort of taste of the story. Hayden, you're on sound watch here.
Now, Britain's changing climate is threatening football with extreme wet weather, calling off games and risking the future of grassroots clubs. 70% of fans have reported at least one match being cancelled because of waterlogged pitches in the past year. In the Luton area alone, 450 matches have been cancelled or postponed in the past 12 months. And it hits non-league football especially hard, with lost ticket sales and the cost of repairs. Here's our science correspondent, Martin Stew.
At Velper Town Football Club, the beautiful game is having to face up to the ugly reality of our changing climate.
Just an example there. This is some of the print and online coverage. We got around the same story. We've done it a couple of times. So you're getting into sort of your BBC Sports, you're getting into local coverage on this stuff. And we've just seen a really, really big period of wet weather recently, not like a very acute, but very, very consistent. So there's been a lot of places that have been affected at a lower level. So there's been a lot of waterlogged pitches, a lot of high water tables, etc. So we also did, alongside this, a bit of work with influencers. This is another way in. I'll also play a little bit of this to give you a flavour, but I won't play all of it.
All right, boys. I'm excited today. You've been training for the next flood, yeah? I used to think there was only one beautiful game. Bear with me. But that was before I discovered this.
That was with Jimmy Bullard, former footballer, former Leatherhead footballer too, down at Leatherhead, who've had lots and lots of flooding issues. And then this one was with Jeff Norcott, who's a comedian, and he's a big AFC Wimbledon fan, and they had a sinkhole because of the rain.
I'm Jeff Norcott, a comedian, and let's be honest, not the greatest environmentalist in the world. I'm definitely not a vegan, certainly not based on this pie. Something happened recently brought climate issues a lot closer to home. There was rain, and a lot of it at my club. Yeah. Oh. I'm a bit of a face around here, so I'm probably going to get stopped quite a lot, and quite a lot of selfies and stuff like that. I don't know what's going on. On the morning of the 23rd of September, 2024, there was a biblical downpour of rain in South London. There was sand coming up through the grass like some sort of weird horror film. And there was genuine consternation among the fan base as to when or if we'd ever play here again. Apparently, it was because of climate change. Of course, everything's because of climate change these days. I'm doing a thing about the climate with these lot. What the fuck was the fact again? So I've come down to the stadium to find out what happened. Just to be clear, okay, I'm not pissing about with this. I'm not gluing myself to, I'm not occupying anything. Don't film this. In about a 9.
So that was football, and we can talk about it a bit more if it's helpful, but it was also, like, as you can see, even just from that Jeff Norcott clip, very not like an activist sort of focused piece of communications, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But this was the sort of more detail on our train FOI, which showed cancellations, where the issues were geographically, the operators that were affected. Whoops. So we that was covered on Sky News. We've done quite a bit on alerts, which is just showing the increase in the sort of chronic nature rather than the acute nature, as I was talking about before. We did a little bit on flood water and like basically flood water having E. coli and poo in it and things like that, which is basically going into people's homes, it's going into schools, it's going into like children's play areas. So we did some water testing, and that was covered by ITV and across quite a few different tabloids. And the climate link stayed in there. So the amount of floods that are happening, that happens more. And if your business is having dirty floodwater in it once a year rather than once every 5 years, that is obviously a different thing. We also did some stuff on where those flood alerts and the risk of floods are more likely to occur. So we cross-reference the flood risk of each constituency with the MRP that was most recent in May 2025, and found who was most likely to be in power in those places. We've done loads of stuff on heat, so hot classrooms, kids are hot during exam periods, teachers really worried about how hot it is in there. We've had lots of things on coastal temperatures and overnight temperatures, the price of sun cream when it's really hot, the impact on pets and dogs. We've also done a bit on heat and health, So we did a little bit on pregnant women, which is covered on Sky. I won't play that because it's pretty self-explanatory, but we had a woman who you can see on the right of that clip here who had given birth in Charing Cross Hospital, and it was 30 degrees in her ward, which is not the temperature you want your baby to be. So we've done quite a bit on heat and health in NHS.
Experts are warning about the danger.
Did not mean to do that, sorry. We've also done stuff on heat and hay fever. So this was on the weather, actually.
It can start as early as January and then run until as late as October. And there are signs the pollen season is getting longer with our changing climate. For us, it puts it around 17.5 days longer than it was 30 years ago.
So we do quite a bit with Gemma, who's a former weather presenter who works at a place called Weather Change, and she helps us to brief weather presenters. So that happens quite a bit. When there was heat waves, we did loads of planned responses. So we did loads of things around tips for what you do in the heat. And we also worked with some of the academics putting a sort of number on how dangerous the heat wave was. And we did all that as a planned load of comms. And then we did a load of stuff that was reactive. So we had a paramedic we've worked with before that went on BBC Radio Leeds. My co-director went on Trisha on Talk TV to talk about people who were trapped over, I think it was Greece and Spain that they were trapped in. And he also did some LBC News on the same thing. So that was like during that really, really big European heat wave. And as I said, we've done loads of stuff on the NHS. So this is NHS overheating. There's loads of publicly available data on NHS. We've also done that on flooding, again, publicly available NHS data, just to show how things like this are also impacting our public services, something that people are noticing and that people are worried about. And then, so that's all of the stuff we've done in like earned media. We also do different kinds of comms. So we've recently launched a podcast, which is on community rugby in Wales. We've been all over Wales, in different rugby clubs, talking to legends of the game, but always rooted in the local rugby clubs, a lot of which are dealing with either or extreme weather, so waterlogged pitches, council games, and or rising energy bills. So Neath Rugby Club, for example, are spending £4,000 every month on their energy bills. And so Bridgend Rugby Club have got a new partnership with Electrify Britain, Electrify Cymru, and they are going to put in some solar and some wind to make some of their games carbon neutral, but also to bring down their bills so they can invest the money that they would have otherwise spent on their energy bills into the club. And so there's loads of community sort of level storytelling in spaces that we know people care about and want to protect and want to save and want to make sure they're thriving, not just struggling to keep the doors open. So that's one load of stuff we do. We also have a library of first-person stories, which includes some of the people I've talked about, like fishers, farmers, footballers, GPs, midwives, mountain rescue. We've got some pupils on there. We've got someone at a football club. So all sorts of different people that have been impacted in lots of different ways. And they're all first person. And that is used quite a lot by journalists as a resource, but also it is used just to do a bit deeper storytelling with people. And I won't spend too long on this, but part of the thing that is interesting about some of this stuff that we do is that we can often see that we can get stories told in papers where the editorial line, as you'll see on the left, is very anti-climate. But what people care about and how it's impacting people in the here and now is covered by the same outlet. So Telegraph it's true for, Times it's true for, Express it's true for, Sun it's true for. And you will often see this sort of spectrum of people are either described as skeptics or zealots. The majority of the British public are in the middle, where a lot of the stories that we do are, which is that they are worried, they want to see action, and they care about this. They just don't want to talk about it all the time, and they don't think about it every day or even every week. But that is where most people are. And so if you can talk to them there, then it makes it a lot easier and more effective. And a lot of these tips I've put here are very similar to what you put up, Hayden, but understanding the audience, what do they care about, what worries them, not being climate first, I would say. We never are. Root your stories and messages in what you know people care about. what's worrying them, what they love doing, what they spend their time on, who gets to tell the story, who do people trust. Authenticity is so important. So who do people trust, but who do people think is authentic? So like Big John just did a video for the Department of Energy and Net Zero. A lot of people trust him. He's talking about turning down your boiler. That's a good example. Not all climate communications need to look the same. It doesn't all need to look like something for climate activists or nature conservationists, those on the left, middle class people. It doesn't have to look that way, even though a lot of it does. And trying things is really important, like having fun and being creative. Trying things, like try a video online if you think it will work. If it doesn't, try something else. I know it's sometimes a bigger risk when you're a politician, but I think there are lots of different ways you can try things. And it doesn't need to be graph-based, fact-based, moral argument-based. It can be a bit different and take the route through something different, like sport, culture, transport, as I've shown. Anyway, I will stop talking because I probably spoke too long.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you, Sophie. I thought that was really, really helpful and great to watch the videos as well. I'd encourage people to check out the podcast if you haven't listened to it. It's on Spotify. It's really interesting. So we've just got a bit of time now at the end for any questions that have come up. And obviously, as I said, if there aren't any, that's absolutely fine. But feel free to add a couple into the chat. The webinar has been recorded, and I can see a few people have asked about kind of the slides and the materials. So a lot of the things that both of us have covered are available online, but we'll also send the slides around. I can see a question that's come in earlier on from Peter. So hopefully, Peter, I think we did maybe answer this in our interventions, but Peter's asked kind of what are our aims and objectives for getting us to talk about climate on the doorstep, and then secondly he's asked, do we need to focus more on climate change avoidance or adaptation? So maybe if we can both answer this if you want. I mean, I would say that in terms of aims and objectives, I think a lot of people think that it's just about if we just continue to talk about climate change, then it will raise the salience and people will care. I think, as Sophie rightly articulated, that's not really the case, and we don't always need to lead with climate change. It's not really something that most people think about day to day. But I think, as Sophie's really clearly highlighted, really trying to bring this into things or issues or stories kind of in the local community. I think the rugby club's story about Nice, for example, is a really interesting one. And I think what I'd also say on this is another aim would be to really emphasize the progress that has been made. And I think I mentioned earlier that, in focus groups, people were really surprised about how much we are decarbonising. And I think we need to balance the kind of negatives with the positives and even on the impact side, which Sophie articulated, showing what action people are taking, and that this is something that local councils are tackling, that local community groups are tackling, to just really not just get too caught up in the negative framing. Did you want to add anything on that first one, Sophie? Oh, you're on mute.
That's the second time I've done that today. Part of doing it is that if you don't do it and then something happens in your local area that is clearly climate related, and then you start talking about it, I think that can also become a trust problem. I think you don't have to be climate first or like do it all the time, but I think to not address it when it's something that a lot of people are worried about, and it might be in loads of different ways, it depends where you are in the country. I think to not do that adds to the potential for the political jeopardy to hit later. So I think it's partly that people care about it and are worried about it, so it's good to talk about. And it's partly because to not do is a bit of a political error, in my opinion. And it sort of goes to Andrew's question, which is why people are suspicious and negative about net zero. I mean, firstly, you wouldn't choose to name it the scientific name if you were branding it as a marketing person. It doesn't really mean anything to anyone, so it's partly that. But it's also partly being weaponized by people who are climate skeptics and deniers, like out and out, like scientific climate deniers, to like use it as a sort of wedge issue in a culture war. And I think to not talk about it at all, it can give a foothold to people who are anti-net zero, who are anti-climate, who are anti-science. And so I think why people are negative about it is sort of a longer story than that, but not letting people who are in that space like monopolize the space, I think is really important. Climate is a sort of day-to-day thing. It's going to be more of a day-to-day thing. It can be quite low heat, common sense. It doesn't have to be like this really big lefty activisty thing that people think sometimes it is. It's really important, in fact, that it's not that.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I just say in response to Andrew's question about net zero, we're not saying that it can't be used or it's never to be used. We just know that a significant proportion of the population don't really understand even what it means. So you do risk alienating people, and that trust gap is really, really critical. So try not to lead with that without kind of qualification. There's a couple of questions come up which I think are really good about kind of stories on reducing emissions and stories on kind of tackling climate change. Now, obviously, Round Our Way's focus is much more on the impacts. On this one, I'd actually probably encourage people to look at an organisation that we both work with quite a lot, which are called Local Storytelling Exchange. So I think their URL is just localstoryexchange.org. I can send a link around afterwards to them as well, and they've got a really excellent kind of page on their website, which is actually done in map format, and they source lots of stories on various issues on sustainable transport, waste management, energy, food, really kind of getting these placed into press as well, and kind of highlighting these everyday kind of stories of people actually taking the action on the mitigation side or the emissions reduction side. Sofie, did you have anything else more to say on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, like, sometimes our stories do cross into that. There's a lots of people we've spoken to on the Substack. You'll find, for example, people who've built their own flood defences. Not ideal. But I would push back slightly in that people getting to tell the stories of how they've been impacted by climate change is also really important. And the idea that we would not want to help people share the thing they've been through because we only want to talk about solutions doesn't feel right to me. And it's also really, really audience dependent. So if you're talking to a progressive activist audience, you think about climate every single hour or day, then their fatalism would be, and their sort of like doom, if you will, would be increased by hearing about impacts all the time. A lot of people don't have that salience. So it is sometimes important for people to see why action is needed in specific areas, not just what that action looks like. And so I think it's really important context. I think the reason we work really closely with local storytellers is I believe, and they believe, that we need both. We need both to tell the story in a full way and make sure that the people who are being impacted get to tell their stories as well as the people who are already in the solutions area. Some of those people are the same. Some of those people go from one to the other. It's not always true, and it's not always possible for those people. And I think it's really important, especially in the diversity of who gets to talk about climate, that we focus on both. And I think a lot of what we do in the end of our sentence will be calling for action, calling for government action, political action, investment, like sports bodies, action from them, support for those people, and sort of to talk about a little bit about that acceptance or adaptation. I think there isn't really, as I said in that stat earlier, 59% of people think that it's not too late for us to tackle the worst impacts of climate change. That has not been accepted, and adaptation is a really important thing because of that, of what I've just said, which is that people are being impacted now. And one of the things we are trying to do is show that it's not just people being impacted way over there in a different country and people who, in time, it's going to happen to people. It's happening to people like you and communities like you now. And so we need action now and in the future. And that is what people want, and it's how people understand it. And all the polling shows that too. The polling I referred to when I was talking earlier about adaptation and mitigation is a paper that I've written with IPPR, which is out in the next week, which I can also send round once it's out.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, I think that was really, really well put. And yes, I agree. Great contribution from the cat. So on that note, before the cat takes over, I think we're going to say thank you all for joining us. It's been a really great discussion. We hope you found it useful. And as I say, it was recorded, and we'll send all the slides around and links that we've mentioned around at the end as well. Thank you very much, everybody.